Welcome to our second class on the Bible. Let's start off with a quick review. Last time we learned that the Bible teaches that God's creation is good, but humans sinned because we wanted to define good and evil by ourselves instead of following God's way. But God loved us so much, He promised to rescue us. God chose His rescue plan to go through Abraham and his descendants. Because God wants to be in a relationship with His people, He uses covenants to guide that relationship. The covenant with Abraham promised land, offspring, and that Abraham and his descendants would be a blessing to the nations. The patriarchs and matriarchs were both faithful and fickle, but God cared for them because of His great love, regardless of how badly they behaved at times. Now we'll turn to the continuation of the story, looking at the Exodus, the most important event in the Old Testament. At the end of Genesis, the people were happily settled in Egypt. At the beginning of the book of Exodus, the people are enslaved. This happened because a new political dynasty came to power and forgot about Joseph and his role in saving Egypt during a long famine. The new Pharaoh was concerned about the Hebrews' increasing population. The Hebrews were foreign people in Egypt. Because of this fear, Pharaoh tried to destroy the Hebrews by enslaving them and directing the midwives to the Hebrew women to kill all of the baby boys at birth. As we can see, Pharaoh is trying to redefine good and evil on his own terms. Moses is born and through a series of events is saved from being drowned in the Nile River by his mother, his sister, and finally one of Pharaoh's own daughters who adopted him. Moses has a unique background. He's a Hebrew raised as Egyptian royalty, giving him a unique window into both cultures. As a young man, Moses saw an Egyptian beating another Hebrew and killed the Egyptian, forcing Moses to flee from Egypt. Moses settled into a quiet life as a shepherd, married, and was raising a family when God called to him out of a burning bush. God summoned Moses to lead his people out of their slavery in Egypt and into the Promised Land. Though Moses was very reluctant to follow God's call and finally came up with many excuses not to go, Moses eventually relented. During this discussion, Moses learned that God's name is Yahweh. Moses returned to Egypt at God's command and confronted Pharaoh. When Pharaoh refused to free the enslaved Hebrews, God sent 10 plagues. The 10 plagues actually represent a holy war between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt. The pagan religion of ancient Egypt was concerned with the control of nature, and Pharaoh was considered a god himself. So whoever was able to control nature was the most powerful god. When Moses and his brother Aaron first confronted Pharaoh and the Egyptian magicians, both sides threw their rods, which are symbols of authority, on the ground. Both rods transformed into snakes, and the question was, who has the greater power and authority? Here's a hint for you. Aaron's rod swallowed the magician's rods. Each plague that followed confronted a pagan understanding of God. For instance, Ra was the Egyptian sun god, yet Yahweh caused 3 days of darkness, emphasizing Yahweh's power over the Egyptian god Ra. Before each plague, Moses offered Pharaoh a chance to change and acknowledge Yahweh as the true God, but each time, Pharaoh refused. The plagues increasingly forced Pharaoh's hand, up to the 10th and final plague, death to the firstborn of both humans and livestock. To save the Hebrews from the last plague, God instituted the Passover meal. The Hebrews were to sacrifice a perfect lamb and paint its blood on the doorposts. When the angel of death saw the blood of the lamb, he would pass over that house. The angel of death swept through the land, devastating the Egyptians, while the Hebrews were saved. Pharaoh finally admitted defeat and ordered the Hebrews to leave. But not long after the Hebrews left, Pharaoh changed his mind. He wanted his enslaved people back. So he and his army pursued Moses and the people. When the Hebrews were trapped between Pharaoh's army and the edge of the Red Sea, God intervened again by sending a great wind to dry a path through the Red Sea for the Hebrews to walk through. The pursuing Egyptian army tried to follow, but the waters rushed back, and Pharaoh and his army drowned. Moses and the people then traveled from the Red Sea to Mount Sinai. They were only about 3 days into the journey when the people began to complain and criticize God. They had no food or water. They even cried that it would have been better for them to have died as enslaved people in Egypt. But Yahweh heard their cry and supplied all their needs: food, water, clothing. At this point in the story, we begin to wonder if many of the hearts of the Hebrews were almost as hard as Pharaoh's heart. Moses and the people reached Mount Sinai, where they camped. Here, God made a new covenant with them. This covenant is based on the Exodus. Yahweh declared that because he rescued the Hebrews from slavery, he then had the right to bind them to him as his special people. Remember, the covenant with Abraham was a covenant of divine commitment. God made all the promises, took all the risks, and formed a chosen people. The covenant at Sinai is different. It's a covenant of human obligation. People have a role to play and responsibilities to keep. God called Moses to meet him on the top of Mount Sinai so Moses could receive God's instructions, what we call the Sinai covenant. This covenant is patterned after other covenants found in the ancient Near East. First, there is the preamble, introducing the initiator of the covenant. Yahweh declared, "I am the Lord your God." Next comes the historical prologue that explained the reason for the covenant. Yahweh said, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Then the terms and requirements of the covenant followed. Yahweh said, "Because I freed you from slavery, you are to live this way and follow these rules." The 10 Commandments and other laws are found here. The people are to preserve and protect the covenant by keeping copies of it, rereading it regularly, and teaching it to their children. Witnesses are then called to authenticate the covenant, and in this case, God called on heaven and earth itself to witness the new relationship being forged. Finally, the covenant finished with blessings and curses. God said if Israel followed the covenant, they would be blessed. But if they didn't follow the covenant, there would be dire consequences. Notice, the covenant at Sinai doesn't make future promises like the covenant with Abraham did. Instead, the people are expected to live with justice and generosity as a response to God freeing them from Egypt. One important thing to note, the covenant at Sinai can be broken. The little word "if" is actually a very big word. God reminded the people, if you follow my commands, you will be blessed. This brings us to the law codes that are found in parts of the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. The law codes are meant to be guidelines for living life with Yahweh and with other people. They speak to how to be in a relationship with a holy God. This is where you need to understand the concepts of pure and impure, clean and unclean. Because God is holy, you can approach God if you are also pure and holy. A holy God cannot be around those who are not holy. If you aren't pure and aren't holy, it's very dangerous to approach God. So the concepts of pure and impure, clean and unclean are essential because you need to know if you are in a pure enough state to approach God safely. It's important to understand that impure does not mean sinful. This has to do with whether it's safe or unsafe to be in God's presence. So it's logical that there are a lot of purity laws for the priests who are tasked with approaching God on behalf of the people. The law codes also govern how people are to live in community with each other. These laws speak to moral behavior. The emphasis is on justice in relationships, that you love God by serving your neighbor as God wants you to serve them. These laws are meant for everyone in the community, not just a select few like the priests or the religious leaders. This type of moral behavior is meant to guide all of life, everything that people think, say, and do. Here's where we begin to understand what it means to be the chosen people. The chosen people were chosen to be unique and to practice exclusiveness, to stand out because of how they behaved, what they ate, and what they wore. This would make them more noticeable in society, so others would be curious and ask why they lived this way. Then they could answer, well, we treat people this way, or we avoid eating certain foods because of the God we follow. Can I tell you more about him? Finally, following God's laws, obeying them, is meant to give life and produce joy. I think we can agree that if we all followed all the 10 Commandments all the time, our lives would certainly be better, filled with more joy and more contentment. In addition, God formed a priesthood to be his representatives on earth, to be the bridge between God and the people. We read instructions on how to construct a portable sanctuary, often called the tabernacle. This is where God's presence is accessible, a place where the people can regain some of what was lost in the Garden of Eden, God's company. But the rules around the priesthood and sanctuary also remind the people that though God is present, he is not tame. All this is done so that an unholy people could live with a holy God. Now, while Moses was getting the law on the mountain, things were falling apart back at camp. The people were afraid Moses was gone for good, so they thought they needed a new God to follow. They pooled all their gold together and formed a golden calf to worship. You can imagine, Yahweh was not amused. God responded by vowing to wipe out the people and start over again with Moses. But Moses interceded and reminded God of his character, of his love and his faithfulness. We read in Exodus 34, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness." Ultimately, God committed to be faithful to his people despite the fact that they were unfaithful. After a year at Mount Sinai, Moses and the people set out for the Promised Land. We read in Numbers 13 that it took 2 weeks to journey to the edge of the land of Canaan, the Promised Land. Moses sent a group of men to spy out the land and report back. The men returned, describing a land filled with milk and honey, but also filled with tribes of people they feared they could not conquer. Because of their fear, the people were doomed to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. It seems as though the people's bodies are on the edge of the Promised Land, while their hearts are still cowering in Egypt. The 40 years of wandering were a time of grumbling and complaints. There were several attempted rebellions, along with murmurings about food and water. God provided the people manna and quail to feed them and water for them to drink. Even Moses struggled, using his rod to strike a rock for water instead of simply commanding water to flow, as God had directed. Because of his disobedience, God prohibited Moses from entering the Promised Land himself. When the 40 years of wandering were over, the people arrived on the east bank of the Jordan River, ready to enter the Promised Land. Moses stood and gave his final speech, which we have as the book of Deuteronomy. It's a commentary on the covenant and has several central themes. The first is found in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and is called the Great Shema. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might." The foundation of Israel's faith is faith in Yahweh alone. Here means to respond with love and obedience. When Israel loves Yahweh with all she has, she naturally wants to obey God's commands. Following the command to love the Lord alone, the people are reminded that they will remain in the Promised Land if they are faithful and obey God's commands. They are to build one major sanctuary in the land where they worship one God in one place. If they follow God's laws, statutes, and commandments, they will be blessed. If they don't, they will be cursed. Finally, Moses urges the people to choose life today, life with God. At the end of Deuteronomy, God took Moses to a mountaintop to show him the Promised Land. Then Moses died, and God himself buried Moses. After Moses' death, Joshua becomes the new leader. Joshua sent a band of men to spy out the land, especially the city of Jericho. They met a woman named Rahab in Jericho, who, though a foreigner, acknowledged Yahweh as God. Joshua led the people across the Jordan River, and just before the Battle of Jericho, had a vision of the commander of God's armies. Joshua asked this divine commander if he was for or against the Israelites. We read in Joshua chapter 5, Joshua went up to him and asked, "Are you for us or for our enemies?" "Neither," he replied, "but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." The commander of Yahweh's army replied he's neither for or against the Israelites. We can understand the message is that as long as Joshua and the people follow Yahweh, God will fight their battles for them. Joshua led the Israelites in a campaign to conquer the Promised Land, starting from Jericho, moving from south to north in the land. At this point in the story, many people ask why God commanded so much fighting and war. Really great question. There are several explanations, including the idea that because the land of Canaan was so corrupted by sexual immorality and child sacrifice, the land had to be cleared of the immoral people. We also must recognize that these stories are like other ancient accounts of battles. As we read further into the biblical narrative, we realize that the Israelites didn't destroy all the people in the land. The story of Rahab, who hid the spies in Jericho and acknowledged Yahweh herself, points to the opportunity the other Canaanites had to turn to Yahweh. After the battles for the land ended, the land was divided among the 12 tribes. In his farewell speech, Joshua also reiterated the conditional nature of the covenant. The people can lose the land if they don't follow God's laws. After the people were settled, the book of Judges reports Israel began to worship false gods. We have to ask, what happened? Well, agriculture in the Promised Land was different from agriculture in Egypt. Egypt, remember, could count on regular floods from the Nile River to water their crops. But in Canaan, farmers had to depend on rainfall. Now, I'm an Iowa farm girl, and I can tell you that farmers are always comparing themselves with their neighbors. If they see a field or a crop that looks really good, especially if it looks better than their own fields, they're going to talk to their farmer and ask what they did differently. Was it a different fertilizer or a different seed or something else? In the ancient Near East, the Israelites, they're the new kids on the block. And when they don't have a river to flood their fields for moisture, they're going to go down the road to ask their neighbors, so what's up with this rainfall stuff? And this is where the fertility religions come in. In the ancient Near East, one of the primary roles of religion wasn't morality, but fertility. The religions focused on the fertility of the land, animals, and families, not ethics. One way the fertility religions explained rain was that rain happened when the male god was having sex with the female goddess and inseminating her. This belief led them to think, well, if we just imitated the god having sex with the goddess, maybe that would get the god in the mood and it would rain. They attempted to manipulate the gods and goddesses by developing a series of temple prostitutes who would have sex in an attempt to make it rain. And the Israelites thought, well, okay then, I need to put food on the table, so let's see what happens. Here's the important point. The Bible teaches that we cannot manipulate God. We can only worship Him. The book of Judges then reports on how Israel fragments. The description of the conquest we read in the book of Joshua was idealized and reports what should have happened. Judges reports what more likely actually happened. Israel betrayed Yahweh. This key verse is repeated throughout the book of Judges. The Israelites did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, forgetting the Lord their God. We can see the themes of reward and punishment from Deuteronomy begin to play out. If Israel fell away from Yahweh, He would use other nations to punish them. We see a continuing cycle in Judges' form. The people would sin and fall away from Yahweh, commit apostasy, and abandon Him. God would then send other nations to oppress Israel, battering them to bring them to their senses. The people would wake up and cry out to Yahweh for help. Then God would deliver them by raising up a judge to fight the oppressors and drive them off. This cycle appears multiple times throughout the book of Judges. Here we can see where the tribes settled. God used the neighboring nations to attack Israel. When the people cried out, God raised up judges. It's important to understand that these judges weren't people who interpreted the law like we think of judges in our society today. Instead, the judges were regional military and political leaders. They were chosen by divine intervention. Yahweh called them to the task for a limited time. The judges didn't form a dynasty and hand down rule to their sons and grandsons. They were essentially one-and-done leaders. Initially, the judges started out well, but unfortunately, as the years progressed, the judges deteriorated. They went from good to okay to bad to worse. Deborah, one of the first judges, was a good judge, leading the people faithfully. But by the time the last judge, Samson, was called, the judges had become very corrupt. In fact, it got to the point that the last judges didn't even know the character of God anymore. In the last chapters of the book of Judges, we discover that not only are the leaders corrupt, but that the whole people have become corrupt. At the end of the book, we realize there are three major problems. First is political disunity. Will the tribes fragment or will they hold together? Second is the transfer of leadership. How will leaders be raised up and how will faithful leadership be maintained? Finally, the problem of spiritual purity. Who will the people worship and follow? We'll talk about the solution to the Israelites' problems next time. Some important takeaways. God rescued the Hebrews from Egypt because He's God, not because they were faithful followers. God wants to be in a relationship of justice and generosity and expects His followers to do the same. The covenant at Sinai, with its laws, guide our lives so that we can be just and generous just like God is. Then the Bible tells the story of what happens when you turn away from God. Don't be surprised when you're punished, as God warned. Now, if you'd like more detail about the Exodus and the stories through the book of Judges, I'd encourage you to check out the additional resources that have reading and study suggestions. Thanks for joining us. Next time, we'll find out how God solved the problems the Israelites struggled with. Until then, keep the faith.